are being used for these three things that you cite,
Yes. And
do they directly create or save a job?
they directly put money into the economy so that demand can be increased. Absolutely.
But they do not dollar for dollar create or save a job.
I don't see how you can say that, because every dollar spent, when you go to a store and spend $1, that is $1 more that the business will have in terms of profits in order to either ensure that a business doesn't shut down or to hire new staff.
My time is short here. Going to the very end of your testimony on page 11, second to last paragraph, Mr. Chairman, we know that in times of economic crisis, the government did not make the solutions. Rather, government gave the American people the tools to fix what was broken. What tools have you given the American people to fix what's broken?
I think that what we are doing is the following. One, we are ensuring that in the short term that people who are out of work or who are facing difficult economic situations have the resources in order to sustain their current existence. The second thing that we are doing is we are creating job opportunities through infrastructure projects and the like to make sure that there are jobs for people.
What tools are we giving the American people to fix what is broken?
And third, we are providing tax relief in the short term, the broadest tax cut in American history through the Making Work Pay tax.
I would happen to agree with you that tax relief is probably the #1 thing that we can do to stimulate the economy and get people back to work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. We now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I wasn't here for this vote, for this package, so it's easy to second-guess or use hindsight. I just don't think it's appropriate. Watching from afar, it was easy to understand the exigency of what was taking place, the extraordinary circumstances that haven't been seen in 80 years in this country, probably from a financial point of view. I also think it's important to recognize the obvious, that beyond the attempt at laser point precision of how many jobs were created or retained, what is being said here today is that it had more than one purpose. And it's also important to recognize that previous administrations have attempted often to calculate the number of jobs created or retained with their programs. It has been borne out that that is extraordinarily difficult to do. So, gentlemen, I recognize that. Having said all that and recognize that this program needs to move forward, I do have concerns that to a large extent at the state level we're flying blind. You yourselves have talked about their cutbacks from auditors and people who would be, I guess, called fiscal watchdogs, given the vast amounts of dollars and the speed of which it had to go out. What's your best guess on time frame to do the things you started talking about? Clarification on rules, Internet access, which was talked about in the GAO report, improved communication, and a specific understanding of what the states can and can't do. Both of you would be great.
Well, I'll start with our recommendations. There's a process in place called the Single Audit Act. It was passed in 1984, and it's a primary accountability vehicle for overseeing state use of federal funds that have been provided along with states' use of money. The single audit legislation could be modified here and guidance put out to make it a more effective, timely tool for Recovery Act purposes. From our perspective at GAO, this is a potential huge missed opportunity unless the guidance is changed to require earlier reporting. If I might put up the chart on the distribution of funds, please. What this chart shows, Congressman, is that a lot of the money at the state and local level, not that one, excuse me, the one by year, shows that most of the outlays to the states and localities will occur in 2010 and 2011. So there's an opportunity to look at what controls are going to be in place over those monies up front through the Single Audit Act. But the guidance needs to be modified, and the auditors need to be funded to do the work. This is a very important investment, could pay big dividends down the road. Secondly, there's a need for continual dialogue between OMB and the states to communicate with the states and provide them information, particularly on the amount of money going directly to the localities in their state, not going through the state entities. And thirdly, there needs to be some flexibility given to states to make sure that they have the proper systems and the proper people and the safeguards on the management side, on the programs that are being funded, to have adequate management oversight. So strengthening those things are important.
Are you talking about dictating that?
I'm talking about, in part, giving requirements for early internal control reporting and funding them. But unless that's done, OMB has certain flexibilities administratively. Some of this could be done legislatively. H.R. 2182 is important that gets passed as well.
But
So,
it would appear that there's almost no ramifications for not following the rules. A, because the rules seem loose or not tight enough, and B, because there's no actual restrictions or what will happen if you don't use the money in the way we describe.
yeah, there are some areas where if money's not obligated, it can be redirected, for example, in the highway area, but most states have met those requirements. So there are some maintenance of effort requirements that the states maintain their spending, both for highways and education. We're following those requirements to make sure that they're met going forward. But by and large, your point is right, and that's why it's important to have these safeguards in place.
We're very sensitive about the concerns that GAO has raised, and for the most part, we agree. We are supportive of the chairman and the ranking member's bill to increase the funding that would be available for administrative types of activities, and we are looking at to what extent we can relieve some of that pressure administratively. I think that we want to continue to explore options with regard to single audit. We believe that the single audit is a key component of appropriate oversight. We do have some concerns about how quickly and effectively we can shrink the reporting deadlines, but it's something that we want to work very closely with GAO and state auditors. With regard to communications, we couldn't agree more with the comments that GAO has made or that the committee has made. The state and local governments are our partners. Every day we are trying to improve our communications. It's not something where traditional mechanisms have worked, and so we are exploring new options such as doing more work through the internet and making ourselves available to conferences, the NCSL, the NGA, wherever we can find opportunities to communicate directly with our state and local partners. We're going to take advantage of those efforts.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if
Yep.
someone could, as we follow up, talk about the internet a little bit more.
Right. Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Bray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Neighbors, Patrick and I are sailors, and if you look at the course, basically the graph over here to your left, and look at it as being a course that is projected by a navigator as opposed to the course that is actually steered. According to that course, our navigator was 80 degrees off course from what was projected by the administration to what really happened was 80 degrees off. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not so sure I would get on a ship or a boat with a navigator with that kind of navigation skills. So the projected course of our economy, our job market, and the actual course were 80 degrees off. Now, do you really think that is an example for the future, that the same navigator ought to be used in the future? Or do we got to go back and take a look at who predicted the course that we were setting, because it definitely wasn't anywhere close to the course that we've taken?
Well, sir, I'm not a sailor, so I wouldn't get on any boat with me. But with regard specifically to the economic projections, what I would say is that the projections that the administration made at the time were fully consistent with the Federal Reserve Board, outside economic analysts, people like Mark Zandi, and private sector analysts. What happened was something that was unpredicted by any of the observers at the time.
Okay. In other words, the experts were all wrong and had no idea what they were talking about at the time, because obviously we're talking a right-hand turn being made, or a lack of a right-hand turn, when you're predicting that we were going to take a hard to starboard, and we just kept, full bore, right, basically the pattern we were going otherwise, and did not see any change in the course set by the job market after we committed $1 trillion in stimulus.
I think the general economic consensus was that the economy was going to be bad. I don't think anybody predicted it was going to be as bad as it was.
Okay. So we can accept that the experts didn't know what the hell they were talking about at the time they predicted this.
I think predicting economic performance is always difficult.
150,000 jobs created or saved. How much money have we spent?
Based on the most recent information that we have obligated $57 billion.
And how much is that per job? Anybody?
I can do the math real quick, but I haven't done the calculation completely.
Okay, I think that is least, if we're going to claim, and it's kind of interesting the way we work this thing, and because the credibility of this administration is going to be threatened if we do not come up with the facts and justifications to the people. We've already saw what happened before with the previous administration, when you didn't have people that were willing to call down the previous administration for making statements they couldn't verify. We want to make sure the new administration doesn't fall into that same trap, because credibility means a lot during these crises. And frankly, with this navigation course, this promise that was made 5 months ago or 3 months ago or 6 months ago, and then seeing what reality is, you see why the average citizen doesn't believe the so-called experts in Washington, including the new administration, if that's the kind of results we're going to have. I think that we need to justify how much money we're spending, and where are the jobs saved, and where have they been preserved. And I think that we've got major credibility crisis here. And I just think that we just can't continue to say it. Just because you keep saying it doesn't make it right, and doesn't make it the truth. And the American people are sophisticated enough to know that Washington has is not going to be able to sell its bill of goods while you end up with a failure rate of over 50%. When you're going to hard to port, when you're saying you're going hard to starboard. No man in the world would get on a ship or a ship of state and follow this navigation for the future. So I think that we need to straighten this out. I yield back, Mr.
Would
Chairman.
gentleman yield?
I yield.
Yeah. Mr. Neighbors, I just have one follow-up question on the gentleman, and I, too, am not a sailor, so I won't go that way. How many jobs are created when you obligate money?
The CEA estimates that roughly $92,000 of government spending equals one job.
Okay, but let me go through that. I mean, I understand if I start handing out $92,000, I can get a lot of people to work for me for a year each. But when you obligate, don't you create no jobs? And when you spend, you create a job. I mean, obligating is an interesting term because it's the amount that in fact is dispersed that creates a job, at least for that day. Isn't that right? That obligating alone creates no job? That
is correct. We have obligated $158 billion, and we have outlaid, actually spent, about $57 billion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Hi. Let's see. I have a specific question regarding the weatherization formula. And it's my understanding that there's a formula that allocates funds among different states. And I was wondering, have you been able to develop an opinion whether that formula is actually all right, in the sense of you're actually putting weatherization funds into areas where you're going to save BTUs? And as a follow-on to that, is there a system in place for actually tracking the energy savings that are occurring as a result of this program?
Yeah, I'll yield to Mr. Neighbors on the details of the program. We at GAO have just in this last 2-month assessment started looking at how states were using weatherization. So far, only about 10% of the money had been allocated to the states to begin planning activities there. More money is going to be coming down the road. We have not yet looked at the allocation formula. We'd be happy to do so, and also look at the measures of performance. Now, the agencies, OMB has allowed the individual agencies to identify performance measures beyond jobs created or saved, and so we'll be looking at that going forward. But since that program is just getting started, so is our work.
Okay, and in a similar vein, there was, in The Economist about a month ago, there was, I believe they were reporting work from the Peterson Institute that indicated that the technologies that we were subsidizing as part of the ARA had costs of between, I believe, $60 and $140 per ton of carbon averted, which makes them not very promising in terms of, and I was wondering, are we putting in place a mechanism to track how effective we will be at actually avoiding greenhouse gases in programs where that is a goal?
I'll defer to Mr. Neighbors on that.
That is one of the things that we are looking at as far as developing performance metrics for all of our programs.
Okay, so they will extend to the environmental goals as well as just the job creation goals?
Correct.
Okay, and then a little bit more on this economic modeling. I guess I would like to say that I'm at least one member of Congress who understands that the predictive power of these models in a differential sense is much better, they're more accurate at predicting the difference between turning a policy option on and off rather than just the absolute predictive power, which obviously was missed in terms of the big downturn we had. And the CEA model that you reported, is it similar to the Zandy model?
It is.
Okay, because I had looked in some detail at the actual formulas behind the Zandy model, and it was not entirely satisfactory, frankly. Things like the interest rate models going out and stuff like this. Is the CEA report, or the details of that model, are they publicly accessible?
They are. They
as
are
well?
available on
So
our website,
all
and
of the
I will
formulas-
provide it to the committee for the record.
Okay, thank you. And let's see, I'm tracking, another thing that we ought to, I believe, be tracking is the fraction of jobs that are created offshore in this. So, for example, when we put a lot of money into health IT, obviously we're going to buy a bunch of Chinese-made computers. If we put a lot of money into smart metering on grids, most of those are produced offshore. And so I was wondering, are we actually separately tracking the jobs created onshore versus offshore for the different programs?
We are not currently. Currently, we are only attempting to estimate the number of jobs created within the United States.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, I guess that's my questions. Thank you much. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Neighbors, I served with Ronald Reagan during his administration, and when he came into office, we had 12% unemployment and 14% inflation. And he decided, against some of his economists' recommendations, to cut taxes instead of just throwing money at everything. And as a result, we created millions of jobs and one of the longest economic expansions in U.S. history. And the economy at that time was as bad or worse than it is right now. Now you said, and Mr. Issa quoted you, you said, since almost all states have to balance their fiscal budgets, even in the face of recession, 40 have cut benefits and services, and 28 have raised taxes, and more are considering both measures. These actions deepen the impact of the downturn. It sounds a little bit like you may have agreed with what President Reagan did, because instead of raising taxes, which would have precipitated a bigger downturn when we had 12% unemployment and 14% inflation, he chose to cut taxes. And he believed that if you did that, you would give more disposable income to individual citizens, their families, and to businesses so that they could make more investment in their businesses and plant and equipment, and it would create more jobs. People would have more money to buy more products, therefore you'd create more jobs because they had to be produced. So what I can't understand is why we're doing what we're doing. The President has proposed raising taxes on health care. It's going to hit everybody. I mean, I think everybody in the place knows that. He's talking about a carbon tax for cap and trade that's going to cost the average family about $3,100, $3,200, maybe $4,000 a year. We've already authorized and appropriated $787 billion for the stimulus package, $350 billion for the omnibus, $52 billion so far for $54 billion so far for the auto bailout, And of course, the stimulus is $787 billion, and now you're talking about another stimulus. How can you square blowing all this money when it's not creating jobs? Vice President Biden said the stimulus created or saved 150,000 jobs, and President Obama asserted on June 8th that the stimulus would create 600,000 jobs over 100 days, and they said it wouldn't go above 8% when we started throwing all this money at it, and now it's 9.5%. It seems like the approach that Reagan took was a more realistic approach because it let people make the decisions and companies make the decisions on how to get themselves out of that mess instead of having the government trying to do everything. And I just want to quote a couple things real quick, and then I'll let you answer. Here's where some of this money is going. Did you know the Florida Department of Transportation is planning to spend $3.4 million recovery funding on the road crossing for turtles and other animals on US 127? That in Minneapolis they're going to spend $2 million on a theater for dance and music events? That in Kansas, the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve's new visitor center and pedestrian and bike project over a highway is going to be, they're going to spend, how much on that? A couple million. $1 million in Michigan for decorative sidewalks and crosswalk planters, landscaping, and so on and so on. It just seems to me that a more realistic approach to solving the problems, and I hope you'll carry this back to the administration, would be instead of just throwing money at it and talk about another stimulus package, we should be cutting taxes, stimulating economic growth by letting people have more of their own money to spend and letting businesses have their money to invest in things they think need to be invested in instead of this sort of stuff so that they can expand their business and sell their products. You can respond.
I will take your comments back to the administration. I do feel the need to clarify a few points. Point one, no one in the administration is talking about a second stimulus at this point. What we are focused on right now is implementing the Recovery Act that Congress has already passed and doing the best that we can with the dollars that you've entrusted us with. So that's what our focus is right now. Second, with regard to the way the package is actually structured, I think it's important to note that over 1/3 of the package is actually focused on dedicated, targeted tax relief, which we believe is a part of a very balanced package to...
Pardon me for interrupting, but the White House, what's her name? Laura Tyson yesterday did mention a second stimulus. I just thought I'd clarify that for you.
Laura Tyson is not an administration official.
She's an economic advisor.
She's an outside economic advisor. She does not work for the administration. But to clarify, the package that was signed into law actually does include what we believe is effective tax relief for the middle class, and we think it will have benefits. But in addition, because of the output deficiencies that the economy is currently facing, spending has to be part of the equation. And what the President has said is that over the long term, this spending, we need to bring the entire federal budget back under control. So I recognize the point that you are saying that there has been a lot of spending that has been done, and it's something that the President is very sensitive to and very focused on. It's one of the reasons why he's pushing so hard to make sure that comprehensive health care reform is completed. Over the long term, the key to long-term deficit reduction is going to be bringing our health care costs under control. In addition, we made it very clear that the Recovery Act spending is something that we are looking at as a short-term stimulative impact into the economy. It's not something that we believe is sustainable over the long term or even advisable over the long term.
The gentleman's time from Indiana has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Hodes from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. The Recovery Act was put in at a time of global financial collapse and severe economic distress in this country, and we are still facing a stubborn recession. I'm a sailor, and I know that sometimes when you set course from point A to point B, sometimes the wind changes, and you need to adjust, and that happens, and sometimes the predicted course isn't the course that you end up sailing. The good news for me from New Hampshire is that I was able to go out on a highway with Secretary LaHood and know that New Hampshire was the first state to put highway funds to use. So the transportation dollars seem to be flowing okay. What I'm hearing from home is that other agencies are having a hard time implementing and reporting the funds that are coming in. The states are implementing billions of dollars of funds, but the concern is that the federal government, we, aren't providing the clear, coherent guidance that we really need to put Americans back to work faster and to provide taxpayers with comprehensive, transparent accounting of those funds that everybody understands. And the chart that Mr. Dodaro, you've put up shows that it looks like the projections for when the full impact of the stimulus dollars is going to hit is a little bit later than what we had originally projected. Is that so?
Actually, that chart, the white bars, are the estimates that CBO made during the time the bill was in conference. So that was always the estimated outlays contemplated under the Act, and I think Mr. Neighbors can corroborate that. The gray bar, in terms of what's been actually outlaid already, we think is potentially slightly ahead of the pace that was estimated, and I think it's because unemployment rate's been higher. That means more Medicaid federal matching assistance is there, and given the fact that the states are under fiscal stress, I think they're moving as expeditiously as they can. The other factor I would say is most of the states, as you know, have end of fiscal years the end of June 30th, so they were waiting for a lot of approval from the state legislatures. Now that's occurred, I think the funds will flow according to pace.
So it's fair to say that while there are some, including some in this room, who are complaining about job creation, that as we see more of the stimulus dollars flowing to the states, and the quicker and better we can get them flowing, the more job creation and preservation we're going to see. Is that true, Mr. Neighbors?
That's absolutely correct.
Now, in New Hampshire and around the country, the growth of small business is very critical to creating jobs. OMB has stated that in its implementing guidelines that one of the goals of the Recovery Act is to provide opportunities for small business, and the SBA has estimated that 60 to 80% of new jobs annually over the last decade are small business jobs. Have you at OMB set targets for the amount of Recovery Act funds directed to small businesses?
We have not set targets, but there are targets in the statute that we are trying very hard to meet, and we believe that we've been able to increase the initial amount of small business funding dramatically. Originally, we were looking at spending at about 4%. We went back and talked to the agencies and made it clear that it was a priority of the administration that small business be an engine for the Recovery Act, and that amount of spending through small businesses has gone up dramatically.
Are you providing any education or outreach to small businesses to ensure that they know how they can access the opportunities for them in the Recovery Act?
Absolutely, both through OMB, but more specifically through the individual agencies that have existing relationships with small businesses and small business consortiums. We are trying to get the word out what type of Recovery Act money is available and how small businesses can compete for it.
Mr. Dodaro, do you think that the reporting requirements to which recipients of Recovery Act dollars must adhere are discouraging small businesses from pursuing or accessing Recovery Act funds?
I think that the reporting requirements, first of all, I don't have an empirical basis to answer that question. We've not consulted with any small businesses or talked with them. I do think, we made a recommendation apart from the one here about making sure that small businesses and others knew of the availability of the funding opportunities and made recommendations to OMB because the website grants.gov was unable to handle the volume, and that there be other avenues explored to make sure people were aware of how to apply for the funding. So that's the extent of our recommendations there so far.
Thank you. And Mr. Neighbors, I encourage you to continue your efforts to make sure that small businesses have access to easily getting these funds to help create jobs in America. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Schock of Illinois, I yield to him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your testimony. I have two quick questions. Mr. Dodaro, I come from the state of Illinois, a state that has roughly a $9 billion deficit. Our governor has proposed a 60% increase in the income tax, and we're struggling with the programs and services that our state currently has. A part of the stimulus plan and part of your testimony speaks to the maintenance effort and the commitment by states that they have to make in order to get the requisite stimulus dollars. My question is specifically, what are we doing as a federal government and what to ensure that when a state says, yes, we will continue to maintain these programs to get X funding now, what are we doing to ensure that actually happens, number one? And then number two, what happens in 2 years from now in a state like mine in Illinois, where we don't have the money for the services we have today, and now we have additional services we don't have today that we will have to support on into the future, and what true force can we take, or what measures are you suggesting that we have that can force them to basically come up with the money at the state level?
I think, first of all, there are a number of maintenance of effort requirements in the Medicaid program, for example, that eligibility standards remain the same as they were through June 2008.
Mr. Dodaro, could you put your microphone on, please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
In the Medicaid program, there are maintenance of effort requirements in the Medicaid program, in the highway program, and the education programs. Those are the big three so far. We are carefully looking at how the federal agencies are monitoring those maintenance of effort requirements. In Medicaid, it hinges on eligibility requirements. Highways, they have to provide, governors have to provide certifications. Transportation is reviewing those certifications right now. There are waiver provisions, however, in there that the agency heads have in order to entertain waivers from the states. Now,
and that's for today.
That's for
what
today.
happens in 2 years when agreement that was signed by Governor A, who's no longer in office,
right,
and Governor B is now having to deal with the reality of whatever commitment was made by that state to maintain those Medicaid reimbursement levels or income levels to qualify for Medicaid. What happens in 3 years from now when the legislature, who's duly elected and has a fiduciary responsibility to balance their budget, decides, you know what, we can't afford these new rates that were specified in the Recovery Act 3 years ago that a former governor and maybe a former legislature had agreed to?
Yeah. Well, first of all, in the Medicaid area, that money ends December 2010, so it's only for a 27-month period in any event. I do think there's a responsibility of the government on the part of federal agencies to make sure that they monitor as it's going along. They shouldn't wait until 2 years.
But what happens, what specific action can we take to force them to honor their word? Because I guess what I'm confused about is we have some governors that are saying, great, thanks for the money, we'll take it. And we have other governors who are saying, whoa, in 3 years we can't afford the commitment that you're all asking us to take in exchange for taking the money today. And yet I'm having difficulty seeing where our power in the Congress or the President or your office has in 3 years to ensure that a new governor and a new legislature has to honor that commitment.
Yeah, well, you're raising a good point. I think it's something that needs to be monitored all along.
Okay, but the only reason I'm cutting you off is I've only got a minute left. I've got a question for Mr. Neighbors. I guess my question is, why shouldn't every governor take the money, tell you whatever you want to hear? Because up until now, I haven't heard a good explanation from you as to how we're going to force them to honor the commitment that we're expecting them to take in exchange for the money.
Well, for example, in the Medicaid area, if they don't honor the commitments, they don't get the matching share
of the funds. For the first 2 years.
Right. Well, that's the only amount of funding that's available. I'll go back. I'll provide you a specific answer for the record for each of these programs of what mechanisms are in place to make sure that those commitments are honored.
Okay. And I'm specifically interested in not how we're going to monitor and tell them they didn't do it, but what specifically in year 3 and 4, which from talking to the governors who haven't taken the funding, is their concern in keeping those higher income levels in place and so on, what our force will be to go after them if they don't. Because I guess my suggestion to those governors who haven't taken the money is it sounds like you can take the money, tell them whatever you want to hear, because there's not a whole lot we can do in year 3 and 4 and into the future. Mr. Neighbors, real quick, reviewing what I've heard in the testimony, I couldn't agree with your final several paragraphs in your testimony, which basically said it's not government that creates jobs, it's not government spending that will stimulate the economy, it's private investment private entrepreneurs and risk-taking, and I truly believe that to be the case.
The gentleman's time has expired, so could you cut it short?
Can I have a few 30 seconds?
30 seconds.
Okay. I guess, you know, what we know, and it's been said by my companions up here, you know, President said there's unemployment would peak at 8%. It's at 9.5%. He's conceded that it's going to reach double digits by the end of the summer. Your testimony here today, $75 billion has been spent to create 150,000 jobs. That comes out to $500,000 a job. Your comment earlier was roughly $92,000 in government spending should create a job. So my question specifically is in the jobs number. If we're not going to say we've failed in terms of being off course on what the unemployment rate would actually be, we're not even near what the expectation is in terms of job cost of government spending to create a job. If we're usually operating under a $92,000 per job creation number, and we've spent $75 billion to create 150,000 jobs.
Gentleman's time has long expired.
That's $500,000. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, yes. And now yield 5 minutes to Congresswoman Spear of California.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As we look at the chart that the GAO has provided us, we're going to be outlaying twice as much money next year as we have this year, which would suggest that if there's going to be waste and abuse, it's going to be twice as bad next year as it is this year, unless we take steps to make sure that it doesn't happen. So I'd like to understand what happens when an outlay has been made to a particular entity. Let's say it's $10 million. And when the first reporting period occurs, they've spent half that money, and we now are aware of the fact that they didn't really generate new jobs, or the program that was anticipated to be constructed is not followed up with. How do we, one, rescind the rest of that money? And two, do you have enough resources to go out there and determine whether the money is being spent appropriately or not?
Well, the answer to your first question is there are sanctions for withholding some of the future funding for certain programs, but it differs by program. So there are some options if there's disclosures that requirements aren't being met for action to be taken by the Federal agencies, but they have to be aware of it and they have to make sure that they promptly address it. On the second question is, no, we do not have at the GAO enough resources to go out and monitor all the activity across the country, and that's why we're suggesting that the single audit process, where the state auditors are already in place and they audit this money annually, that they be required to do earlier internal control reporting now before a lot of the money spent in 2010, and that they're provided some funding to make sure that they can carry out their normal activities. If changes aren't made, the single audits for the year, fiscal year 2009, won't be issued until 6 to 9 months after the end of the fiscal year. So you'll already be into the next fiscal year. There is a network in place through the single audit that can be exercised with modifications to provide greater assurance that the money is being spent properly. But OMB and the Congress need to act on our recommendations in order to effectuate those changes.
All right, Mr. Neighbors, what's your position on that?
We concur that the single audit is an important component of ensuring that there's appropriate oversight. We want to make sure that there's appropriate money to the state and local governments to make sure that they don't have to reduce the administrative staff and the oversight staff that they have, and we're dedicated to making sure of that. We're working with the chairman and the ranking member to in support of their bill to make sure that even more funding could be potentially available to state and local government to conduct those audits. A second piece that we are doing, which I don't want to get lost, is that working with Earl Devaney, who is the head of the Recovery Oversight Board, he's made it very clear that he sees one of his primary responsibility as getting in on the front end of projects to make sure that as much as possible we can make smart decisions and we can help the agencies make smart decisions so that we have the mechanisms in place so that money isn't wasted. once the money is wasted, it's a shame for all of us. If we can get in and shape the programs ahead of time so that we can minimize the amount of waste that comes out on the other side, that would be best for the American taxpayers and for the Congress. So we're working very hard with Earl and with the various IGs to try to set up those mechanisms ahead of time as well. So I think that between the state auditors, the local auditors, and the IGs and the Recovery Oversight Board, we're trying as much as possible to create a network of oversight that will try to minimize the amount of waste that could occur from Recovery Act spending.
All right. Final question. If there is fraud, there should be a means by which that money can be returned to the federal government. Have you put that in place? Have you thought about it? What are you going to do about fraud?
Well, I think that's a basic responsibility of the federal agency. If we find fraud or potential fraud, we will refer the matter to the Justice Department for further investigation. We don't have law enforcement authorities, but we do make referrals to the Inspector Generals, to the IGs. We have made available to the public a hotline where people can submit allegations of fraud. The Recovery Act also requires the Inspector Generals to do the same.
How do you advertise that hotline?
It's on our website. We put out press notices regarding it. So far,
how many calls have you received?
We've received about 61 allegations so far. Have referred some to the Inspector Generals. There's about 25 or so that we're looking into more deeply to assess the merits of it, and we'll be following that up. So we're taking that. Pardon me?
Could you report back to the committee on what you find from those hotline inquiries?
We'll be happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now you have 5 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Congressman Flake.
I thank the chairman, thank the witnesses. I'll ask a series of questions, and if I could get a pretty quick answer, I'd get to more here. The Vice President has said that he is kind of the sheriff on this, his role is to provide oversight. What specific role does he play? Does he go to meetings? What does he do?
The Vice President holds regular meetings with the cabinet agencies and with the implementation officials from the agencies, and he's also very involved in terms of reviewing agency plans with regard to broad goals of federal spending.
Thank you. When we see programs that we are told are getting funding, it kind of makes us wonder when you say no, if you say no. For example, we're told that $800,000 of this recovery funding will be used for a runway at an airport in Pennsylvania that has around 20 passengers a day that fly to Washington. Why wasn't that money turned down? And if it's not, can you give me any specific examples where you've said no?
There are a number of examples where we've gone back to the agencies and asked a series of very hard questions, and projects were removed. With this specific project, I would have to go back to the Department of Transportation and find out more about the criteria that were used to make this award.
But you don't know of any examples where you've said no, just hard questions?
Most of this work is done at the agencies. I would want to go back to the specific agencies and get the examples from them.
The Vice President has said that some people have been scammed already. That's his quote. Can you give any examples of that?
I'm not sure of what the Vice President was referring to there.
Should we ever take anything serious said by the Vice President? Or is somebody assigned to go and retract what is said?
I take what the Vice President says very seriously.
All right. Well, it would be good to know what he's referring to if he's...
I'm just not familiar with that quote.
Okay. With regard to, again, to these, CNN Money just put something out saying that $75 billion had been allocated already, paid out. You say 57. Which is correct?
The most recent information that I have is 57.
57, and you say 150,000 jobs have been created. That's some 380,000 per job, where the goal was 92,000 per job.
Oh, I think that there is a discrepancy. I'm giving you the most recent information that we have with regard to obligations. It's 57 billion to date. I would have to go back and look at when the job creation number was actually calculated. It's not the exact same time period.
All right, but it's safe to say that we're considerably north of the figure of 92,000 that's the goal.
I would have to go back and take a look at that, but I will provide that information for the record.
All right. So with projects then, we were told initially that they needed to be shovel-ready. I have to tell you, I grew up on a farm, and my dad always had projects that were shovel-ready. They usually involved rubber boots and a corral. But I'm just wondering if there's any other criteria. Again, going back to this thing, I still have not heard of any examples coming from any agencies. And again, going back to this one, and Mr. Burton named some others, these projects where you'd have to say, you know, unless you just concede that throwing money out is going to create jobs somehow or it improves the economy, that you know, perhaps it would be better to give it in the form of tax relief and allow individuals to spend it. But I still would love for you to come back to the committee or something and give us information on at least one instance, some time where an agency has said, no, just because it's shovel-ready doesn't mean it's worthy.
I'm happy to provide that information for the record.
Thank you. I yield to...
I thank the gentleman for yielding. If they could put the federal deficit will reach levels never seen before up on the board. Mr. Dodaro,
yes.
Earlier you showed us your declining one. I just want to make sure. This one appears to be your chart, but referred to in positive deficit. And I want to make sure because, again, I told you I had to take stats and I hated it. Your downward one appears to be the equivalent of that one. Same thing, but everything in reverse. Obviously starts a little different. And if I read it correctly, we have increasing deficits as far as the eye can see projected when you express it positive, because we're in deficit and your chart was in negative deficit because you have these minus numbers. Can you explain the difference between those two charts?
It's basically just the reverse explanation. I mean, there's different ways to explain this and to display it. One, the chart I'm showing is the annual deficit, what it's expected to be as a percent of gross domestic product. There are also measures that you could show where there's the percent of debt held by the public as a percent of gross domestic product.
I appreciate that.
And any way you do it, we got a problem.
Isn't it more standard when you talk about deficit to have it as a positive deficit? In other words, a growth in deficit normally is an upward number. In your case, the downward might have people think that things are getting better when in fact down in your case or up in the other case, both are growing deficits.
Right. Down in our case means you're going
bad.
You're going bad. You're heading in the very wrong
direction. Okay, I just want to make sure everyone understood that downward chart is really bad, and that's where we're going right now.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Right. Let me announce to the members that we have 3 votes. We have a 15-minute vote and 2 5-minute votes. The committee will adjourn, and we will, after 5 minutes after the last vote, that we will reconvene. Okay. We need to sort of get clarification on, you know, and one in particular that if jobs are retained, how is that in terms of job creation, you know, and that a lot of areas, you know, they would have had to lay a lot of people off, but as a result of the money, they were able to retain them. And I think in many instances, it just made so much sense to do that, because when you look at education where you were able to have teachers, you know, that would have been laid off and would have had these huge class sizes that now are able to have their jobs. I think that it makes sense. And of course, I want to thank you and want you to look into these issues, because we're going to always have these until we come up with some clarification. So OMB, you really have to have some guidelines to make certain that people understand, you know, what job creation means. Is it a part-time job, half-time job, whatever? I mean, these things need to be sort of made clear so we know where we're going, so we can answer questions when they come up. And I now yield to the ranking member, and then after the ranking member, we're going to dismiss this panel.
I would like to echo the Chairman's accolades of your being here today and your willingness to respond both here today and some of the follow-up that you've promised. This committee is dedicated to have you back essentially every time there's a new report, which is every 2 months. And I hope you'll indulge us in something close to that schedule. Based on what the Chairman may want, we may do it informally or formally, but it's very clear that we feel it's one of the core responsibilities of this committee and one that we want to work on a bipartisan basis. I agree we should go to the next panel, and I thank you for your